Hello and welcome to a brief talk about some of the wisdom teachings that can be found in Shakespeare's The Tempest. My name is Saira Salmon and I'm just going to talk you through, pick out a few of the things that can be seen. Now, The Tempest is a play about transformation. It can clearly be seen as a play that outlines certain aspects of initiation. And there's a series of misfortunes and ordeals and tests and trials that are conducted both by and to Prospero that allude to these steps on the initiatory path. And the play very clearly belongs to the same class of religious dramas as the medieval mystery plays. Let's begin by just looking a little bit at the old mystery schools. Now, the old mystery schools, regardless of their origin, were really formed around teaching. Their teachings were around the basic initiatory structures that have been passed down through the ages, through the different wisdom traditions. And they used, amongst other things, myths and dramas to provide the storyline for these mysteries. And we see these allegories of human initiation of the human soul in both popular myths and fairy tales. So this is a very archetypal structure. The mystery schools were attached to public temples, but they weren't for everyone. You had to show yourself worthy for them. More often than not, it was the cultural and political elite, but also those who showed themselves worthy were accepted in. You had to be the right quality of being, as it were. And they taught various skills. Various skills were developed and techniques were used. And the initiate was put through a series of trials and ordeals, tests, which were experiential. It wasn't just about head knowledge, head learning. These were things to be experienced. So they were testing you at all levels, whether you had a moral backbone as well as whether you were physically courageous. As well as having the intellectual capacity. And it's thought that structures like the Great Pyramid, far from being a tomb, were actually part of an initiatory structure. So it was something that formed part of some of these tests of initiation. And these teachings were secret. They were secret on pain of death. This knowledge wasn't to be messed about with. It wasn't for everyone at all at any level. And it could potentially be very dangerous if it fell into the wrong kind of hands. With the advent of Christianity, all of these teachings ended up going underground. By the 3rd century AD, the church had actually closed down all of the mystery schools. Not that it actually, would have nothing to do with the teachings. The church still, at its highest levels, still partook in this, but for everybody else, it went underground and went into secret societies. The flame was kept alight, as it were, through the secret societies. But the church understood how dangerous this knowledge potentially was, and it wanted full control of it, basically. So within the mystery schools, they taught the secrets of initiation. And here they were helped to attain altered states of consciousness and to understand and master the natural and the universal laws and to become masters of themselves. That's most important. The way they were taught, it was very structured. There were different levels of attainment according to ability and development, and not everybody worked their way up to the top because they just didn't have, they managed the lower levels but not the higher levels. So it wasn't a given that once you were taken into a mystery school you would go on to reach the highest level of attainment. And they used drama and they used myths in order to test and to experience and to demonstrate a lot of what went on there. One of the things that sits within all of this is it speaks to the principle of the divine spark, this divine spark within every man. And we find this in the Orphic teachings, the very early Orphic teachings onwards. And if we're talking about it in alchemical terms, we might sort of say it's about this sort of divine spark that's within every man, that's there waiting to be polished and to be perfected until every one of us steps forward into the full potential that's our birthright as a human being. I like to think of it as a lantern that's shuttered and only showing a little of its light. And as we work and do our work, so the shutter opens and our light shines into the world to be of benefit. But of course, none of us have to do this. We don't have to do the work. This is where free will comes in. You know, it's really up to you as to whether you start up on this path or not. It's about the evolution of the soul. And initiates were taught to break free of established and fixed ways of thinking and to move beyond the world of the five senses. This is into the invisible world, to deal with the world of energy, the world of, some might call it the world of the imagination, or nowadays we'd sort of probably refer to it as the quantum world. So they worked beyond Newtonian laws and were attuned to the universal or the divine laws. So they were working beyond the world of the five senses. So initiation is an expansion of consciousness. It's a gradual perfecting of the soul in beauty and gentleness and love. And very often extreme conditions could be presented to the initiate or the chosen in order to test them. Because they had to be, they had to be a worthy vessel. They had to be, sort of morally incorrupt. They had to be physically courageous. They had to have this deep understanding and well of compassion within them. So there were many qualities that were being looked for. And yes, they could lose their lives. Potentially they could lose their lives. And we see the echo of this in some of today's tribal ceremonies, often where a male child steps into adulthood. Maybe he's sent off out into the wilderness to see how he can survive. And there are those that don't. So, initiation is not for the faint-hearted and can be dangerous. Now, these initiations would take place over many years. I mean, it's not something that was done very quickly. You developed and you evolved and you worked on yourself. And you worked with your knowledge and understanding until you perfected it. And it follows very much archetypal patterns and experiences. And you stepped into the lower mysteries, and then when you proved yourself worthy, you went on into the higher level of mysteries. And this is one of the ways of showing this. This is a ladder of initiation, but it can also be seen as a cycle as well. It can be presented as a cycle. But this is quite a nice way to look at it. And here we've got the ladder that shows the sort of 7 levels of initiation. And we can say that there are 8. If we bring in the preparation phase, we can say there are 8, which takes us to speaks to the octave, as it were. And by the end of The Tempest, by the end of this play, we see that various characters start to either step onto this ladder or are already partway up and are working their way further up. So Prospero, when we begin this play, is at the level of the initiate, and he's, in order to move up further, there has to be a sacrifice, there has to be a death of some sort, possibly psychological, so that he can be reborn as the master, as the adept. So we're going to look at how these are shown in the play. And, broadly speaking, there are 3 stages of evolution. So the lowest level is man's brutish and animalistic nature, which is characterized by ignorance and, a lack of control over emotions and desires, very sensual, very brutish. The second level, which is probably your average human being, and that's the partly informed man. As they say, a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. And it's characterized by the intellectual nature, very proud of his learning and his sort of thinking capacity. I think we look around us and we can see that most of our society is really at that level. The third level is one who's gone beyond the mind. He's mastered the mind and he's gone beyond it and is divinely enlightened, and as well as being intuitively aware, he's married head and heart, as it were, and is conscious of the great interconnecting web of life, and his every action is attuned to the great law of love. It's the great law of love that sits at the center, not just of every being, but also at the center of the universe. So he becomes at one with all of this. So The Tempest is a mystery play. It's a play about transformation and an allegory of initiation, which mirrors these pagan initiatory practices. And it's set on a magical island, an island that's full of sounds and sweet airs that give delight and hurt not. So it sounds like a magical, wonderful place. So I'm going to pick three characters, Prospero, Caliban and Ariel, who all clearly inhabit different levels of consciousness within the play, and let's have a look at them. We'll begin with Ariel, our airy spirit, and Ariel is key to the whole play. Without him, Prospero, for all of his learning, all of his cleverness, all of his arts, he can't perform the magic that's absolutely central to this play. He very clearly works with the higher laws, Ariel, and is a being of light, who, when Prospero finds him initially, has been imprisoned. He's been imprisoned by the dark, by Sycorax, a witch, for 12 long years, because he refused to serve the dark. He's a being of light, he doesn't serve the dark. So he was imprisoned for 12 years, and in return for releasing him, Prospero demands another 12 years service from him. And immediately, there's a hint, there's something that should make our ears perk up, because 12 in the mysteries is an important number. So we're immediately aware, therefore, that he's special. He's not an elemental, though. He's often referred to as being an elemental, but he's not one of the elements. He's at home in and with the four elements, but he is in control of them. He's above them. He's very much a part of this world, as he can manipulate the laws of this world to great effect, both physically and at the mental level, the mind. He can form illusions within the mind. We see him do that very effectively. So is he the fifth element, what's called the fifth element in alchemy? Is he quintessence? He's not an element of air, but you could say that he's etheric air of the spiritual realms. He's spiritual fire and spiritual water. That's fire that doesn't burn and water that doesn't wet. In other words, St. Elmo's fire that we hear him speak of at the beginning of the play. And quintessence is a very tricksy element. It's very difficult to handle and very playful and very mercurial. And we see again all of these things within Ariel's makeup. It's also worth noting as well that Ariel, like all spirits, has to be commanded or asked to help. Ask and ye shall be given, it says in the Bible, and this is very true. You speak to anyone who works at any level spiritually, and they acknowledge and understand that you have to ask the spiritual realms for help. Otherwise, the spirit world can't interfere. That's one of the laws. So it's worth noting, before we go any further, the symbology of where Ariel was found, trapped within a cloven spine. The spine is symbolic of the human spine, and the pine cone, the pineal gland, or the metaphysical third eye. And this alludes to the kundalini, or the life force in man, which, when he's of a sufficient state of purity, rises up the spine and helps to build the psychic body, increasing intelligence and consciousness, expanding consciousness. And you might also hear it referred to as being the dragon or the serpent energy, or mercurial fire water. So there is a level at which you could say that Ariel can be seen as Prospero's kundalini, rising up through the chakras towards illumination and love. Wonderful thought, isn't it? Now, Ariel, we see him very much also as the hierophant to Prospero's development. He's the tester and the initiator of Prospero, and he both serves and guides Prospero. But he only serves him, again, it's worth noting this, he only serves him because of the light that he sees in Prospero. He doesn't serve the dark. So he inspires Prospero and he tests him. And there is a key point in the play where, Prospero can go one way or the other. It's a knife edge point. And often, some directors totally miss this. But when you see a version where the director's absolutely got this, it really is quite pivotal. And Ariel sort of says, your charm so strongly works them that if you now beheld them, your affections would become tender. And Prospero replies, dost thou think so, spirit? And Ariel responds, mine would, sir, were I human. And at this point, Prospero has to make his choice. Does he go for karma, for the law of revenge? Does he take revenge, or does he enact mercy? There's also a clear hint to the Hermetic teachings through Hermes or Hermes Trismegistus, and he can be linked to very easily to Hermes, because Hermes was the Hierophant. He was the conductor of souls and could travel through the different realms at will. He was a guide, a teacher, as well as a challenger and tester of the soul in training. And again, St. Elmo's fire was also known as Hermes' fire. What he is also hinted at in his song. We get another hint here. Hark, hark, the watchdogs bark. Hark, hark, I hear the strain of strutting Chanticleer. Now the watchdog is, in the mysteries, is the guardian of truth, and Chanticleer, or the cockerel, is the teacher of truth. So again, you know, hints for us to pick up there. Okay, let's go on and have a look at Prospero, who epitomizes the archetype of the mage or wizard. And the wizard can manipulate natural laws to his own end. But, and this is important, he doesn't work for divine. Wizardry is about temporal power, miracles about divine power. Prospero is good, we see that. I mean, he goes to great pains to reassure Miranda that no one is hurt in the Tempest and everything that's going to follow. There's no harm done, he says. And he too, within the play, he is a Hierophant of the higher mysteries. He acts as Hierophant to some of the other players to test and to initiate them. Now, as a good wizard, he obviously has his staff, which is symbolic of spiritual fire, and he has his books, symbolic of spiritual water. And these are earthly representatives of heavenly wisdom and intelligence. But by the end of the play, we're going to see that these are being given up. They're being sacrificed. There's the sacrifice. And they're being released as they're no longer needed. As he moves on to a higher version of himself, basically, he doesn't need these props any longer. So he's giving up temporal power. He's clearly an alchemist. Now, an alchemist is not necessarily someone who's working to transform base lead into gold, but really more to transform the base metal of the human psyche into the gold of the illumined soul. So we see him working as an alchemist at this level, and he himself is transformed in the process. Part of the teachings that you learn are that you yourself cannot ascend unless you can't reach up and reach higher unless you yourself reach down and help someone below you up. So it's an ascending ladder. As you go up, you bring others with you, and we very much see this taking place within the play itself. So he shines his light like a beacon. He's a role model to others, calling them to their better selves. Within the play, there is a level at which we can ask ourselves, are Ariel and Caliban representative of polarities in his nature? Because we have the dark and the light, we have the higher and the lower, as it were. So very archetypal representations. And then in the middle stands Prospero. And the play really is, sort of acting out the question, which way will he go? Will the dark win, or will the light? We see he has a deep love of esoteric power and knowledge. He pursues this even to the detriment of his kingdom. He loses his kingdom because of this. So he's immersed in this esoteric power, as it were. And he's very clearly reached the pinnacle. He's reached the height of his powers. And yet the use of magic is manipulation of our understandings of the realities beyond natural laws. So these powers are dangerous. So this is why they were so secret. The mystery schools were so secretive about them. They were dangerous in the wrong hands, and they are dangerous when used by the ego. It's the intent with which you can be a good person and use these powers badly. So they're dangerous when used by the ego, even with the best of intentions. So Prospero is treading a very dangerous path. And at the beginning of the play, more often than not, in the way it's played out, it isn't clear exactly what his master plan is. He's maybe, is he actually going for retribution? Is he bringing all these players to the island in order to enact retribution? Or has he all along had this higher outcome in mind? It's not exactly clear. He faces a very great temptation because he can take revenge on those who did him and his own a very, very grave wrong. So Prospero could very easily have been ambushed by hubris and by that need for revenge that actually sits in most of us. At this hour, he says, lies at my mercy all mine enemies. I mean, just think about that for a moment. You've got them all within your power. What are you going to do? And he has to willingly let go of his love of this power, this esoteric power. He has to reach for mercy and redemption, not revenge and retribution. And he acknowledges this. The rarer action, he says, is in virtue. The rarer action is in virtue than in vengeance. So he acknowledges how difficult it is. But mercy transcends justice and transforms karmic situations into something, much, much better. But interestingly, it doesn't actually replace justice. It transcends justice. It doesn't replace it. And the adept the initiate who's reaching for adepthood has to learn to balance these contradictions. Because forgiveness is fulfillment of love. This is the breath of God. And part of what Prospero has to do is he has to surrender to his shadow. He has to acknowledge and own all of himself, both the dark and the light. And he says it very clearly, this thing of darkness, I acknowledge mine. And only once he's accepted himself, he's owned himself, taken responsibility for himself, warts and all, only then can he truly become a master of his own nature. Okay, moving on to Caliban. Caliban, as we can see, is right at the beginning of the initiatory path. He's got a long way to go, hasn't he? His desire is most brutish, and his soul is very clearly still asleep. It's still unconscious. He's a creature of heavy, dense earth, heavy, dense matter. And he's despised by the intellect. Again, the intellectual mind, someone of Caliban's nature, very much holds it in despite. There's no respect at all for it. And we see this with Prospero. There is no respect for his innate nature by Prospero. Now, Prospero's been given reason. He's tried to rape his daughter and things like that. But still, Prospero, until the end, really almost has no place for Caliban. And Caliban is the son of a witch. And the witch can be seen as the dark feminine, the dark, devouring, destructive feminine element. Is he Prospero's repressed shadow? We can ask ourselves, is he symbolic of that? He's everything that Ariel is not. He's fearful, he's savage, deformed, earthy, slow, lazy, sensual. He's all of these dense, heavy vibrations. But from darkness, light is born. From this dense matter, light is born. And we see within Caliban the glimmering, just the glimmering of something there that's waiting to be polished and waiting to be honed. He longs for a vision of true beauty and nobility to follow and worship. He says of Trinculo and Stefano, these be fine things, and if they be not sprites, that's a brave god and bears celestial liquor. I will kneel to him. He wants something to look up to and to aspire to. He's got Prospero, but Prospero disdains him. And in the way of human nature, when somebody doesn't like you, when you're at this level, you certainly don't like them back, as it were. But he's also the tester and tempter of Stefano and Trinculo. And he offers them power and status and sex and riches, and they succumb. They fail the test, they fall at the first hurdle. And it's interesting to note that while they're very much taken in by Prospero's glamour on the rich clothes and things, he's not taken in by that glamour. And so by the end of the play, we see him just beginning his transformation when Prospero finally acknowledges him. At the very end, he is slightly repentant, and he sort of says, some of his final words in the play are, "I'll be wise hereafter and seek for grace." So finally, at the end of the play, Prospero basically goes back to the mundane world. He realizes that all of his study, all of his knowledge is useless if it's not used wisely. It needs to be of service to mankind. This great intellect that mankind is blessed with, it's there for a purpose, and it's there to be put into the service of mankind. And in his epilogue, Prospero acknowledges one of the most profound teachings of the wisdom traditions, and that is all is one, as he asks us for his help on the next stage of his journey. He acknowledges that he can't do it without us. It takes all of us to progress this evolution, as it were. It's a work for all of us. So a very great play. I've only really touched on some of the things that you can pick up within it. So, have fun studying it and seeing what else you can find. And I'll leave by asking you some questions, just to really get you thinking about some of the things this play is trying to teach us and tell us about. What would you do? What would you do if your enemies lay within your power, people who had done you a very great wrong were in front of you and were totally within your power? Would you do what most of us would do, and that's reach for the karmic version of the law? I demand justice, an eye for an eye. Or do you have it within you to go for the law of redemption, the law of mercy? And what does it take to set free the Ariel in each of us, that higher self, that higher spirit, that thing of the light that sits within each of us, that divine spark that's waiting to be released? What would it take? What does it take to set that free within you? And then your intellect, this wonderful, wonderful mind that we all have. Does your intellect serve mankind? Do you use it in service to mankind? Or do you use it in service to your ego? There's very great teaching within each of those. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed it, found it interesting, and enjoy studying the play further. Thank you.